She stood frozen under the grand chandeliers, her hands trembling against the white lace of her gown. The music had stopped. The whispers had grown louder. All eyes had shifted away from the bride and groom, away from the polished perfection of the millionaire's wedding, and onto a single woman standing timidly at the side of the hall. She wasn't wearing silk, or satin, or pearls. She wore a maid's uniform, black and white, plain and unremarkable. Except for the curve of her belly that revealed she was heavily pregnant. The bride had called her forward, her voice sharp like the crack of glass, demanding that the maid step into the spotlight. And then, in front of everyone, she forced the woman to sing. A cruel smile tugged at her lips as though this moment was meant to humiliate, to crush whatever dignity the poor maid still had left. But what happened next was something no one could have predicted. It would shatter pride, unveil hidden truths, and leave every single guest with tears in their eyes. Before we go further, if you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the power of doing the right thing even when the world tries to humiliate you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder today, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel Kindness Corner. Your support helps us spread more stories that touch hearts and inspire change. The maid's name was Grace. She had worked in the household of the bride's family for years, often invisible, moving silently through corridors to polish glassware and sweep floors. No one asked her story, no one asked what she carried in her heart. She was simply the maid, the one who smiled politely, the one who carried trays, the one who knew her place. But Grace had not always been this way. She once had dreams, luminous and alive. She once sang in a small church choir, her voice rising like light through stained glass windows. People used to say her voice could move even the hardest soul. But dreams don't always survive poverty, betrayal, and life's merciless turns. Her pregnancy was the result of heartbreak. The father of her child was gone, leaving her to fend for herself in a world where even survival seemed uncertain. Yet Grace continued working because she had no choice. And on that wedding day, she carried more than the weight of her unborn child. She carried humiliation that seemed endless, judgment that pierced deeper than knives, and the knowledge that she was always one step away from being discarded. The bride, Isabella, came from wealth and status. She had everything that Grace never did: beauty, opportunity, power. Yet, under the surface of her polished smile, envy and insecurity brewed. On her wedding day, standing in a gown worth more than most people made in a year, she sought not joy but domination. When she noticed Grace standing quietly near the back of the hall, Isabella smirked. To her, Grace was a reminder of imperfection, a shadow that did not belong in her fairy tale. So she did the unthinkable, she pulled Grace into the center of the room and demanded that she sing for the guests. It was supposed to be entertainment, but everyone knew what it really was. A performance of cruelty. A spectacle to belittle a maid who had no power to refuse. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, ashamed but unwilling to intervene. Others whispered behind their hands, expecting awkwardness, maybe even laughter. Grace's face flushed with heat, her body trembling as she tried to steady herself. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and escape the humiliation that was now painted across her soul. Her voice had been her secret, her sanctuary, and now it was being used as a weapon against her. But something stirred within her as she looked down at her belly. She thought of the child growing inside, the innocent life that would one day ask her what kind of mother she had been. Would she be the kind of woman who bowed her head and accepted humiliation, or would she be the kind who rose above cruelty, even when the world seemed determined to crush her? Grace closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to sing. The first note trembled, soft and uncertain. The room went silent. Then her voice grew, steady, powerful, filling every corner of the hall. It wasn't the voice of a maid. It wasn't the voice of someone meant to be hidden in shadows. It was the voice of a woman who carried the weight of pain, yet still found beauty in the depths of it. Her song was raw, soaked with emotion, and impossible to ignore. Guests stopped breathing. Tears welled up in eyes that moments ago had looked at her with judgment. Even the chandeliers seemed to shimmer differently as her voice rose higher, wrapping the room in something sacred. And then it happened, the millionaire groom, Alexander, stood from his place. His eyes had not left Grace since the first note. There was recognition in them, as though her voice awakened something buried deep in his memory. He walked forward slowly, each step echoing through the hushed hall, and when he reached her, he did something that stunned everyone. He took her trembling hands in his and bowed his head with tears streaming down his face. The bride froze, fury rising in her chest. This was her day, her moment, her stage. Yet here was her groom, the man she had thought belonged entirely to her, giving his heart to the maid through nothing but reverence and awe. She hissed his name, but Alexander ignored her. His gaze remained locked on Grace as he whispered words the entire room strained to hear. "You saved me once with that voice." What no one knew, not even Grace, was that years ago, when Alexander was at his lowest point, broken and drowning in despair, he had once stumbled into a small church late at night. He had been lost, unsure whether life was worth continuing. And then he heard a voice, pure and unshakable, singing softly in the dim light. That voice had given him hope when nothing else had. That voice had pulled him back from the edge. That voice had been Grace's. He never saw her face back then, only the silhouette of a young woman singing to the heavens. But now, here she was, in flesh and blood, carrying the same voice that had once saved him. The guests gasped as Alexander dropped to his knees before Grace, his hand resting gently on her pregnant belly. He looked up at her with tears and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "No one humiliates the woman who saved my life. Not today, not ever." The room erupted in whispers, then silence, then a wave of emotion that swept through every heart. The bride's face twisted in rage, but there was nothing she could do. Her plan to humiliate Grace had backfired spectacularly. Instead, Grace was now lifted higher than anyone had ever imagined. Alexander announced in front of everyone that Grace would never work as a maid again. He promised her security, dignity, and a life where her voice would be celebrated, not mocked. Some guests applauded, others cried openly, touched by the unexpected turn of events. Grace stood in shock, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Not as a servant. Not as a burden. But as a woman whose worth was undeniable. The wedding, meant to be Isabella's perfect dream, became a lesson etched in everyone's heart that day. Pride and cruelty can dress themselves in lace and diamonds, but they will never shine brighter than humility and truth. Grace's courage to sing, even when forced into humiliation, became the very act that set her free. As the sun poured through the tall windows, illuminating her tear-streaked face, Grace realized that life had given her a second chance. Her unborn child would not grow up seeing a mother bowed under shame, but a mother who stood tall even when the world tried to crush her. And the man who had once been a stranger now looked at her as though she was the most important person in the world. If this story touched your heart today, please take a moment to like this video, share it so others can feel the power of kindness and courage, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. Every action you take helps us reach more souls with stories that matter. And before we end, I have a special request for you. Drop a comment below and tell us, what does true dignity mean to you? Your words might inspire someone who desperately needs hope right now. Grace's song ended, but its echo lived on in every heart that heard it. And as she wiped her tears, she whispered silently to her child, promising that they would never live a life of shame. The millionaire's reaction had stunned them all, but for Grace, it was more than that. It was proof that even in the darkest of moments, light could break through, and sometimes, the voice you thought was silenced forever could be the very thing that saves not just others, but yourself.